Hello, this is Professor Kent Lee. Welcome back to my videos. In this video, I would like to talk about technical and academic vocabulary and how they are different. And if I ask you, how are they different? Well, you think, well, they're often bigger, longer words, and that's often true, but there's more to it than that. We're going to talk about the jargon of different fields. So jargon is the vocabulary that's unique to a particular field, whether it's an academic or general field. So, for example, footballers have their own jargon. Tennis players have their own jargon. Mechanics have their own jargon, their special vocabulary, as well as academic and technical fields like biologists and physicists and linguists and psychologists and so on. And then within more academic and technical fields, sometimes we use the word nomenclature. That means the technical and specialized vocabulary of a particular academic, scientific, or technical field. So I want to talk about technical vocabulary today, academic vocabulary, and go through some examples to illustrate how they are different. You often think of kind of words that are really specialized to particular fields that you don't hear about in other fields. Like if you're not a linguist, you're not going to know words like phonology and morphology and syntax. Well, computer programmers use syntax, but they mean something different. And that's a good point. Sometimes words have different meanings in different fields, and that's part of it. So sometimes there are just very unique words, but sometimes we take normal English words and we kind of press them into service and use them differently in different fields. Let's go through some examples. First example, well, the word research. What does it mean when you do research? An average person might think, well, I've got a research paper to write for my college class, so I go to the library, I go to the internet, I read some scholarly articles, and I kind of learn about the stuff in order to write my own paper. And that's kind of more colloquial or common use of research, which is okay in that kind of context. Another use of research that's really colloquial and which really bothers me actually is when it comes to like uninformed opinions about politics or popular issues. People will say, well, I did my research and I found that coronavirus is a conspiracy from, so-and-so government. It's often nonsense. What that means is not real research. It means, oh, I went to Google and I searched for some information that confirms my own stupid opinions or my own ill-informed opinions. Stuff written on blogs or YouTube channels by people who don't really know what they're talking about. I went and found information that confirms my own ideas, especially people who promote really ill-informed claims will use such a language. I did my own research. No, you did not do research. You simply did a Google search and found somebody's information or ideas that fits your own preconceived ideas or biases or such. And I want to say, oh, really? You did your research? Do you have your own research lab? Did you recruit your own subjects? Do your own statistical analysis? No, you didn't. So that's a really that's a real abuse of the term research. So again, in normal kind of speaking, normal language research, I went to the library and I did some research to write this paper I had to do for my college class or a company report or something like that. That's okay in a non-academic sense. But in an academic context, it really is something different. It means I did my own original research. I conducted my own study. I did my own scholarly research or my own scientific research. Myself, for example, as a professor, as a full-time researcher, as a grad student, I conducted my own original research. And that's an important way in which the word research really differs from kind of common or colloquial uses of the term research. And it's really important to understand. We're talking about original research that follows the established procedures within a field, like within science. You do your own research following, the scientific methods of your field of study. Or in a social science like psychology or linguistics, you use established procedures and techniques to do your own, social science research. Or in humanities, maybe it's more qualitative or theoretical, but you're following the kind of guidelines and established procedures for doing original research in that field of study that would meet strict criteria for what could be published, say, in an academic research journal. That's research. Let's take another one, statistics. Statistics is another word that gets used very differently in common speech than in, say, scientific or academic context. And kind of more common speech where you're talking about, I have some statistics, here's some statistics. And it's often things like frequencies, how often something happens, percentages, like 49% of people surveyed say they think this about the president. Count data, ratios. Those are kind of what we would consider middle school statistics. It's the kind of stuff you learn in middle school or maybe high school. And it's kind of numerical or quantitative data, but it's not really quantitative research. It's simple data that may or may not tell you anything. In fact, there are ways you can easily manipulate those kinds of statistics. We call it descriptive statistics. It merely describes things, but it doesn't necessarily tell you if it's really meaningful or not. It really depends on the context and who collected the data and such. A popular gum commercial in the US used to say, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend you use this gum. Who are these dentists? You keep repeating that in your commercial, but who are these dentists? How did you count them? Show us the evidence. How did you collect this data? They don't say. In academic context, especially in quantitative research and in science fields, social sciences, statistics, like descriptive statistics, they're merely descriptive, and it's not going to be the main thing that we rely on in order to draw conclusions, especially in quantitative research. For example, let's say we compare IQs of two groups. Now, I don't quite believe in IQs as really valid, but okay, let's just take it as an example. Let's say we have the IQs for a set of maybe several hundred professors, and let's say their average IQ is 125. And then we also have IQs for people who are working as engineers and scientists in industries like computer and tech companies and such. And let's say their average IQ is 120. Okay. Is there a meaningful difference? You can't really tell necessarily, because in one group you might have a lot more variation. The actual scores might be more varied. Or in one group, the IQ scores might be skewed a lot more toward one end or the other. That is, you might have a lot more people on the lower end or higher end of the spectrum. And you can't necessarily draw any conclusions like, are these two groups really different intellectually? You don't know. Unless you do some more sophisticated statistics, what we call inferential statistics, in order to infer that there's a difference. And I'll say more about statistics later on in another video. So inferential statistics are tests that maybe you may not be familiar with unless you've taken a statistics course in college or in graduate school. T-tests, ANOVAs, correlation, regression, factor analysis, all that fun stuff, technical stuff. It's more technical stuff that's designed to actually look at a scientific hypothesis and compare two groups, or look at a set of data and see if there's something really meaningful going on that we can make a scientific conclusion about. Let's talk about correlation. Correlation is a relationship, okay? Warm temperatures correlate with people having more time outside. Okay, it's a relationship. But in math and social science, correlation is more of a specific mathematical or statistical relationship. That is, you can plot, if you remember your high school algebra, like an XY chart. If something goes up here on this axis, it means that there's a correlation, a positive correlation, as this goes up, this goes up. For example, temperatures go up, and then heat strokes, heat-related illnesses go up. There's a mathematical correlation. You can express it as a mathematical formula. And what's important is correlation does not mean causation. Correlation does not mean causation. In some cases, you can say that if there's a causal explanation. Yeah, higher temperatures, more people going to the hospital for heat-related illnesses. Of course, there's a causal explanation. In other cases, there could be a correlation, but no relationship, no direct relationship. Maybe something else is causing it. For example, in summer, more people eat ice cream. More people also die from drowning, like in the ocean. Does it mean ice cream causes drowning? No. There is a correlation, but there's no relationship. Because the drowning and the ice cream consumption are both caused by something else, which is the heat. High temperatures are causing more people to eat ice cream and causing more people to go swimming and thus drown. Similarly, you can make a correlation between eating ice cream and shark attacks because more people are swimming and happen to have encounters with sharks. There's no relationship. So there's no relationship. We have to say correlation does not mean causation, or correlation does not imply causation. Unless you have some kind of a causal explanation, like a clear logical cause for why X would correlate with Y. Let's talk about things like gravity. You think of gravity as like, that things fall down. Okay, sure. But, a physicist would have a different understanding of gravity as an attractive force. And depending on how they study it, they might view gravity in terms of the attractive force on a cosmic scale between like large objects in the universe, or on a very micro scale. And how does gravity relate to other forces? Mass is another thing where physicists have a different understanding. You think of mass, as like, I weigh 80 kilograms. That's my mass. Well, okay, but you're thinking of weight probably, and mass is something different. You can look it up. Physicists have a somewhat different definition of mass that's more technical, and it has to do with how an object's movement can be changed by an applied force, or it's a technical definition that's different from your definition of mass. You think of mass as kilograms, and to a physicist, different than weight. You think of mass and weight as the same. To a physicist, they don't care so much about weight, usually, they think about mass. Okay, let's move on to different fields. Self-esteem. Self-esteem. You might think, that's how I feel about myself. And generally true, yes. Now, in order to study it, like in psychology, though, you need a more precise, specific definition, something you can measure. So you need to define it in a technical way. In order to do psychology research, especially if you're doing quantitative research. And so the average person's definition of self-esteem will be different from how a psychologist defines it. You might think of self-esteem as how I feel about myself, and that's true. But in order to study it, you need a more precise definition. And so psychologists will have more precise, specific scientific definitions. Sometimes we use the term we operationalize. That is, we will, maybe for the sake of a study, we'll define it in a very particular way, or it might be defined in a particular way in general in a particular area of research. For example, in psychology, self-esteem it's defined more like how you evaluate yourself and your worth and your abilities. And it's considered a very complex kind of thing because self-esteem is actually has a number of different dimensions to it, and there are different dimensions you can define in different psychological theories, and you can come up with like a quantitative survey that you can give to people to measure their self-esteem along different dimensions. So there's more of a precise technical definition of self-esteem and the different components or different dimensions of self-esteem. Same thing with happiness. I mean, psychologists want to study happiness. For decades, they studied, what makes you depressed? Important research. But there are also now psychologists who want to study, what makes us happy? Happiness research. And in order to study it, they're going to define happiness not in terms of like how you feel at the moment. So in colloquial English, happiness is like how you feel at the moment. I feel really happy. I just had the most wonderful chocolate I've ever had. I feel so happy. Or oh, I got some money, I feel so happy now. It's momentary. Now, in psychology, though, they will define happiness more in terms of a longer term kind of mood or attitude that's stable over time. So it's not like a momentary happiness, but kind of more of your general satisfaction, like life satisfaction or long term emotional states that they can measure. They can use surveys to measure your general happiness or life satisfaction in order to study what makes people happy in life, what makes people feel more satisfied with their lives than others. Now, let's look at metaphor. Okay, metaphor. Here's an interesting word. You think you know what metaphor is? Okay, you learned that in maybe high school, middle school English or language class or literature class. Sure. In literature theory, literature specialists will define a metaphor in a very certain way. It's a specific type of idiomatic expression that has a certain structure. In linguistics, there's an area of linguistics that also talks about metaphor, but in a different way. It's a different understanding of metaphor compared to, say, literature scholars. Literature scholars will define it as a certain way, as a literary device. Linguists talk about it in terms of semantics and pragmatics, like the meaning of words and how the meaning kind of gets extended and used differently in different contexts. So, for example, linguists who talk about metaphor will look at things like, okay, phrasal verbs, like prices went up. That's sort of a metaphor, and a literature scholar would say that's not a metaphor, but a linguist who works within, say, cognitive linguistics will say, yeah. So there's the literal meaning of go up, to rise, and then there's a more metaphorical use in things like prices went up. The price has gone up. It's a metaphor. It's a meaning extension that's based on, but not the same as the literal meaning of physically going up. And language is full of metaphors like that. In fact, when I said language is full of metaphors, I used the metaphor full of. That's a metaphor, as in like physically filled up, but I'm talking about something abstract. Language is full of metaphors. English and other languages are full of metaphors. We use linguistic metaphors all the time. We don't use literal interpretation as much as you would think, because there's so much metaphorical uses, the way we use words in a different way than their original literal meaning. That's linguistic metaphor. Let's take narrative. Narrative is a term in literature that has a certain definition, a sort of sequence of events, like a story, a personal experience. It's a sort of genre. So literature scholars will talk about narrative as sort of a genre or a technique or mode. There'll be a technical literary definition of narrative, something story-like, a story-like description of something. There's a sequence of events. Now, in psychology, there is also the word narrative, and it's used differently. Narrative in psychology is something like this. If I ask you, okay, what kind of person are you? What made you the way you are? And I would get you to tell me your life story, not like the mundane details, like I was born, like, in October or in such and such a city, but tell me about the kind of person you are and the key events in your life that made you the way that you are, the key experiences and events in your life that shaped you and made you the person you are. And it's a very complex kind of set of experiences and identity. It's kind of your sense of identity as shaped by your experiences. It's a psychological concept of who you are and what made you that way. It's a way of talking about your psychological identity, your sense of yourself. And this word also gets used in other contexts. We talk about a political narrative. In political science, for example, politicians have different narratives. Oh, this is like conservative politicians might say, this is our narrative of how our country came to be and what we believe in as patriotic citizens of our country. This is our history and what made us the way we are. This is our character. And maybe liberals or progressives will say, no, it's more like this, a different focus, a different narrative. This is what we believe our story is our country, what kind of people we are, what kind of people we should be, our values, and the history of our understanding of the history of our country that shaped us. Those are political narratives. That's become an important thing because more and more we see real strong differences in the way that politicians on the right or the left talk, the way that they understand what they're talking about, the way they explain to voters, okay, this is why the economy is bad. This is what the other side has done. It's part of their narrative. The other side, they're not patriotic. They're trying to destroy our country. They're trying to ruin our country. Well, they're thinking within a political narrative, a framework, a sort of complex understanding of how things are and how things have come to be in their country or in the world. Another one, myth. Myth you think of as just a false story, but in literature and anthropology and sociology and other fields, it's more of a genre. It's more of a technical name for genre. It's some kind of a story or history that's, and the focus is not the fact that it's false. Normally we think of a myth as something that's false in kind of common speech. But as a genre in literature and other fields, it's more like it's a genre. It's a type of story that explains, for example, where a people came from, or it explains why things are. So a lot of national myths or cultural myths. The focus is not so much on the fact that they're not true. There's probably some element of historical truth to a number of myths. But the focus is it's kind of an old story that explains where this people came from. It explains origins or explains causes, why things are the way they are. Where did our country come from? So we even speak of American history as being somewhat of a myth because how it's presented to school kids is sometimes inaccurate, and it's kind of mythical. It gets kind of idealized, distorted, and so Americans might grow up with kind of a mythical, a somewhat unrealistic understanding of their origins, their national narrative, and true for a lot of countries or cultures and such. So when we talk about, say, religious literature as myth, literature scholars are not trying to insult it and put it down and say it's not true. No, they're talking about these stories in, say, religious literatures, scriptures, and religious texts, whose function is to explain, okay, why things are the way they are. Why is the world bad? Why do men and women seem to have different roles in society, at least in traditional societies? It's because of the founding myths, these religious stories that are designed to explain things. And that's what a myth is in literature. Now let's take language. It's actually complex. What is language? Depends on who you ask. Now, for the average person, language is like, oh, there's French and there's German, there's English. Okay, those are languages. But what about language? So linguists would think of language as a general human ability. All humans are capable of language, whether it's English, French, Korean, Chinese, or sign language. That's language. It's a universal human ability. And even then, there are different ways of understanding it, depending on what kind of linguist you are. If you're a linguist who focuses on language as a cognitive psychological ability, or as a logical system, or as a social phenomenon, a social system. And I'll talk more about that in another video. Then there are languages. And like French and German and English and Dutch, okay, anything. Okay, no problem. Sure, that's easy, right? Well, what about this? How do you define what is the German language? Well, you might think, well, can they understand each other? Well, okay. Think about this. You have standard German. Down here in Switzerland, you get these really hard German dialects. They're considered German, but I can't understand them. A typical German from Germany can't understand them. Yet it is considered German, and Swiss people, about 70% who identify as linguistically German, will call their language German, although it's very hard for Germans to understand. And then looking at kind of northern Germany and Holland, you've got Dutch, the Dutch language spoken in Holland. Well, along the border, there are a lot of dialects of Dutch that are similar to the dialects of German on the other side of the border. And some of these dialect speakers can understand each other. Dutch dialect speakers and German dialect speakers. Where do you draw the line? It's kind of arbitrary because it's partly based on cultural and national identity. Then you've got the sort of Dutch that's spoken in Belgium, which we call Flemish. Where do you draw the lines? It's the same almost as the Dutch spoken in Holland, but sometimes it gets called Flemish, like it's a different language, and it's not. It's really like a different dialect. Defining a language is really hard. You could do the same thing with Chinese. What is Chinese? Because the Chinese spoken in Beijing is not the same as what's spoken in Hong Kong, and linguists will consider the Hong Kong Chinese to be a completely different language called Cantonese. And in fact, linguists distinguish about 5 different Chinese languages that are separate languages. Mandarin in northern China, spoken by, especially by educated speakers, and various similar dialects in northern China. And you've got Cantonese and Hakka and other dialects in the Chinese-speaking world. People from these different dialects or language groups can't understand each other. They're like different languages. So how do you define a language? The way a linguist would consider a language is different from the average person. The average person is not aware of these complications, but a linguist is going to say, well, it's a complex thing because it depends on, well, can you understand each other? Mutual intelligibility. Can two people from these different language varieties understand each other? But then there are also cultural, social, political factors involved as well. And sometimes the distinctions are somewhat arbitrary, like dividing up German and Dutch. It's kind of like a continuum from Flemish, Dutch, North German, Standard German, Swiss German. Linguists have a different understanding of how you define a language or how you define language. So, technical vocabulary, academic and scientific vocabulary, is different from colloquial English, not only because there are a lot of specialized, unique words in different academic fields that are not known outside of that field, but there are a lot of words, common English words, that get used differently in academic fields, and they get used differently in different academic fields. Think about the way the word narrative is used in literature studies versus psychology versus political science. For example, the way that language is used differently by different types of linguists, different types of social scientists, for example. These are things to be aware of as you are studying in an academic field and as you're learning to write in an academic field, because you have to get used to the vocabulary of your field and how words are used differently in your field, in your particular field. And it might look like a common English word, but it might be used differently. And it might even be used differently by different scholars or different schools of thought. And that's something you have to pay attention to as you're learning to write in an academic field, as you're studying in an academic field. Next time, I'm going to talk about an important word, and that's the word theory, because it means something very different in academic and scientific English. And it's really important that you understand this no matter what academic field you are in, because most any academic field is going to use the word theory in a way that's different than in colloquial common English. And as well, you might also use words like model and law and hypothesis, and it's important to understand the difference. More in the next video. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.